In part 1 of this video, we looked at aperture and shutter speed and how that affects our exposures. In this part 2, we're going to look at ISO adjustments, metering modes, and special situations where we need to do something different to affect our images. So we saw that the aperture controls the amount of the image that appears to be sharply in focus, and obviously the shutter speed, the amount of time that the shutter is open, determines how much movement there is in either the subject you're photographing or in the movement of the camera that you're holding. So aperture controls the amount of apparent sharpness, shutter speed controls the amount of apparent movement in the image, either subject or camera. So the third thing we're going to look at now is ISO, and you'll see here that a standard ISO setting for most cameras is 100 ISO, and each time we increase that ISO setting by doubling it, 100 to 200 means that we've doubled the sensitivity of the sensor. So it now needs half as much light to get the correct exposure that we measured previously. So if we see here, if we go back to 100 ISO, we've got 1/25th of a second at f5. We're still on 1/25th of a second, and it's now going to be one stop smaller aperture. And if we keep going by changing those ISO settings, doubling it again to 400, doubling it again to 800, doubling it again to 1600, we're starting to get a much smaller aperture required to give the right exposure for that given shutter speed. So why wouldn't we use a high ISO setting for all of our photography to keep our shutter speeds high and our aperture small? Well, because as we increase the ISO setting on our camera, we get what's called more noise in the image, which degrades the image quality. So it's always best to shoot at the lowest possible ISO setting that will give you an acceptable result, and only increase the ISO setting when it's necessary. If you're hand holding a camera and the light level is low, then obviously you would increase the ISO setting to allow you to get a handheld exposure that doesn't have excessive movement. So now that we've seen those three aspects, how do they work together? Well, we have different exposure modes in our cameras. This one here is currently set on shutter speed priority, where you determine the shutter speed, and if we change to what's called P for program, the camera makes all the decisions for you and the results are variable. It's not recommended for anyone that's really interested in photography. It's for beginners only, and it doesn't really teach you anything. Full manual exposure allows you to set both the aperture and the shutter speed, and it's very handy when you're learning photography in the first instance to experiment with different shutter speed and aperture combinations. But in the real world, most people would either use shutter priority or aperture priority, where you, the photographer, determines the aperture and the camera will adjust the shutter speed accordingly. You'll see here as I reduce the size of the aperture, the shutter speed is lengthening, and because the camera is mounted on a tripod, I can use a very slow shutter speed without any concerns about movement of the camera. But then again, my subject may be moving, so that may or may not be a desirable outcome. And the third way that we would use our cameras would be to use what's called auto ISO, where the camera will determine the ISO setting to give you an acceptable result regardless. And as you increase the aperture to a smaller value, you'll see that the ISO has crept up to quite a high amount, and it's kept the shutter speed at an acceptable amount. Now if I was to zoom the lens out, the camera is programmed to reduce the shutter speed to a smaller amount to compensate for the movement you get with a longer lens, and it's now increased the ISO setting to its maximum value I've programmed for this camera, and therefore I would probably want to reduce my aperture size to then start to bring the ISO setting down. So let's have a look at some options back in the studio, and we'll look at these a little further. So taking a look now at the use of shutter speed, we can use shutter speed for great effect. Obviously here in this image we've got a photograph of the dog taken at a very high shutter speed of 1/400th of a second, using a longer focal length lens to freeze the action. And then of course going to the other extreme, we can use a very long shutter speed. In this case, well, it was only 1/3 of a second, but it's allowed the movement of the water to create a nice blurry effect. And we can do similar things, such as with these polo players, using a slow shutter speed of 1/15th of a second, bearing in mind that these are moving quite fast and we're using the camera to pan or follow the action. We've managed to get the sense of movement and action happening by the use of a slower shutter speed. But there are of course other situations where you might want to use a fast shutter speed because there's a risk of movement. For instance, this image here was taken out of the window of a helicopter flying up into the Mount Everest area, and with helicopters there's a lot of vibration, and so what I've done is I've used a fast shutter speed. We don't need a small aperture because we're photographing everything at a distance, and what we have here is a fast shutter speed to stop the vibrations from the helicopter. But then of course we can use other situations where we don't have an option because of the lighting situation. This was photographed in the oldest Buddhist temple in Tibet. Very dark, very poorly illuminated, just a few light bulbs spread around and some candles, and even using, in this case, 1200 ISO and a widest open aperture, we still had to get to a fairly slow shutter speed of 1/50th of a second handheld just to allow enough light onto the sensor. So shutter speed can be used for different effects depending on what the intent is of the photographer. And just another indication of what happens when you increase the ISO setting on your camera. This is a test graph from DxO Labs, and at your camera's base ISO setting, they've tested it to have, in this case, a Nikon D800, a dynamic range in excess of 14 stops of exposure. Very wide dynamic range. But as you increase the ISO settings, let's say down here to 6400, our dynamic range has dropped down to about 8.5 stops. So not only have we reduced the quality of the image by introducing noise or graininess, we've also decreased the dynamic range, or in other words the range of brightness that the camera can capture. So it's always better to try and capture your images at the lowest possible ISO rating. So what does this high ISO noise look like? Taking this image here captured of the gorilla, it was photographed at 8000 ISO, which is a very high ISO setting. It's a little bit hard in this cropped version to see exactly how much noise there is, but if we really zoom in, it's about a 1:100 crop. You can see here there's a lot of graininess and apparent noise in the image. Now, that's not necessarily an insurmountable problem, because with things such as the Topaz denoise and other noise reducing software, you can reduce the amount of noise, but of course the image quality can be degraded. So that's the image without the noise reduction applied. This is a version with noise reduction applied, and if we look at another image where we've got a split view here, on the left hand side is the image after noise reduction has been applied. You can see the graininess in the background has been dramatically reduced, and you can see this side is the before side. So there's a lot of graininess in the background, and we've managed to capture a lot of detail on the bird, and using the noise reduction we've still managed to maintain that. So we can compensate to some degree for the use of high ISO and noise reduction software, but it's always better to try and use as low a possible setting that we can. And while we're talking about exposure and what is correct exposure, it's important to understand an important thing called the histogram. And on modern mirrorless cameras and some DSLRs, you will get a histogram display available on the monitor or in the viewfinder. And it's quite simply, the histogram is simply a display of the brightness levels of the various areas in your image. So in this image we have a predominance of darker tones, and that's because there is a larger amount of darker areas in the image. We'll come back and talk about that a little bit later, but the other important thing to remember is, what is the camera telling you? Because sometimes the camera tells you some wrong information. And one of the things is, we talk about the way the camera is measuring the light, and we have different metering modes. And if we were to look at this on this particular camera, the most common use is what's called a matrix metering, or a combination of different areas of the image area that the camera uses to determine exposure. But you also have available a center weighted area, and also usually a spot area for critical situations where there may be distracting elements. But typically most people most of the time would use what's called matrix metering in their image assessment, and bearing in mind that the camera doesn't always tell you the truth, and sometimes the camera gets it wrong. So we have this histogram display to help us, but also we need to make some assessments of how to change the exposure in the camera when the conditions vary from what the camera understands to be normal. As we've explained in another video that I prepared earlier called "Your Camera is an Idiot," there are times when the camera's metering and the exposure settings don't get it right. And these are generally in situations where we've got some unusual or extreme lighting. And if we look at some of these images, you can see that there are situations where the exposure settings by the camera have been overridden by me. And for instance, in situations where you have excessively bright light, such as snow or ice, it will sometimes fool the camera into underexposing the image. And that's because the camera assumes that there is a range of tones in every image that is going from dark to light. And in a situation where you have an excess of lighter tones, the camera may well think that it's an overbright situation and darken the image down or underexpose, and therefore we need to adjust. In this case, I have given it a positive exposure bias of 1/3 of a stop, and going into situations like this, this particular situation in the Buddhist temple, very dark situation, I needed to give this an exposure increase to try and capture some of the detail in the background, and allowed some of the foreground to blow slightly out of exposure. And there are many situations where because you've got a brighter subject and a darker background, you would need to dial in some exposure compensation. Again, we've got a dark subject against a bright background, and I've needed to increase the exposure so as to put more light onto the subject and allow the background to be a little bit overexposed. And on some of these other ones, we've got to do some other tricky things. This was a scene of the Parliament building in Budapest, photographed at night time, and it was actually photographed from on a boat. And what I needed to do was to try and not overexpose the building because of that large expanse of night sky. So I had to give it a minus exposure compensation of 1 step or 1 stop. And so in many situations the camera's metering can be fooled by the unusual lighting or unusual composition. Here, for instance, I photographed ice on the black sand beach at Jökulsárlón in Iceland. We have black volcanic sand and white ice, or blue-white ice, and so to not overexpose the ice, I've had to use a minus exposure of 2/3 of a stop to try and control that exposure. And of course we can do that by doing a test exposure and looking at the histogram on the back of the camera. The only problem being, as we know, that histogram on the back of the camera is not always giving you an accurate reading, because it's taking that reading from a JPEG version of the image, not the raw data. But it's a good indication in any event. And in some situations like this one, I've blended 2 images together with different exposures. We looked previously at this, where we used exposure compensation, or high ISO, that is, to capture this image, but because of the white puffin and the darker background, I wanted to make sure that I captured the white tones correctly, so I underexposed this slightly to render the details correctly. And there are many situations. Again, I have an albatross out in the open ocean in the Antarctic. Dark blue ocean and a white bird. If I'd allowed the camera to just meter for the overall scene, it would have made the albatross blown out or overexposed because it was compensating for the dark ocean. So I've given this a minus exposure compensation of minus 2/3. So there are lots of situations where the lighting is unusual or a little bit out of the ordinary, where you need to apply some exposure compensation. Many cameras allow you to do this quickly. Nikon cameras in particular have a quick exposure compensation dial that allows you to quickly dial in a little bit of exposure compensation. And now with mirrorless cameras, where you have a histogram that you can view in the viewfinder or on the back of the camera, you can get a bit of a live indication of where the exposure is looking, bearing in mind that it's not 100% accurate, but it's a good indicator. Now, one last thing that we want to talk about when it comes to exposure is what happens when the lighting level is inadequate, regardless of the options that you have available to you. Now, some cameras come with a built-in pop-up flash, and that can be useful in some situations where we want to add some additional light into the subject, or particularly with portraits and things like that. But as the only source of light, it's a very poor substitute, because the light source is directly in line with the lens and it gives a very flat and unflattering result. But as an extra light source, what we call fill-in flash or extra illumination, that's ideal. And of course, we also have things like bigger flash units that would either sit on the camera or can be used remotely, that offer a great solution. And of course, smaller varieties also work. And then in addition to that, we can use things like with the off-camera flash, we can use things like bounce flash, where we would bounce the light off a ceiling or some other object. Or in other instances, we can use simply things like just a piece of paper or a white card or a purpose-built reflector to throw additional light into a subject. And I'm going to show some examples now in the studio of when we can use flash as an extra illumination source that really can make a big difference to some photographs. And now we're just going to have a quick look at some situations where using additional light sources will help with getting the correct exposure. And in some cases, the lighting may be poor, the subject may be close enough to the camera that allows you to use a flash or other exposure modifier such as a reflector. And in many cases, people think that the only time you might want to use the flash is when you're indoors and at night time, and that's probably the least beneficial occasion. Here, for instance, we've photographed some birds up in the northern part of New South Wales or southern Queensland, and the bird itself was in a darker area, so we've used the on-camera flash to give a little bit of extra illumination and also to pop a little highlight into the eye, because the bird itself was in a fairly dark and poorly lit situation. And the same thing here with this portrait of this young girl taken in the remote areas of Tibet. She was standing with the sun behind her. As you can see, the shadow here was falling towards the camera, and so she would have been largely in shadow. And what we've done here is we've used the flash on the camera to throw some extra light into her face and to provide some extra illumination. So the use of a flash or a reflector in many situations where it's not just dark but the lighting is poor can make a big difference. This one, for instance, was taken inside a house in Tibet, and it was very, very dark, and so I needed to use the flash on the camera to provide any illumination at all. But of course it is a little bit flat, but in some cases that's the only option you have. And in other situations like this, photographing in the old farm buildings in Iceland, I wanted to try and balance the indoor and outdoor exposure, and using the flash to provide some illumination here did help provide some extra light. So there are many, many situations. where using flash or supplementary light makes a big difference to the exposure. And one thing that you can do with the flash is have a bit of fun and experiment. And here, this is taken at Luna Park in Sydney, where we've got the rotor where the kids sit on here and spin around and then get thrown off by using a slow shutter speed, using what they call slow sync with the flash of the camera. I've shot at a 15th of a second so that we've got blurry motion with the movement, but then the flash has frozen part of the image so that we get partly a frozen image and also some sense of movement. And again, other situations where using the flash to provide a little bit of extra lighting, where the subject has their back to the light, just helps to balance out the light. And of course, sometimes with birds and other animals that are close enough to the camera, adding a little bit of extra illumination will help reduce those shadows. So what do we call the correct technical exposure? What we're looking at here is the completed image after it's been processed in Lightroom and Photoshop. And we can see from looking at the histogram that we've got a wide distribution of tones. We have no clipping in the highlights. We have a little bit of blocked up areas in the dark areas, but that's fine because that's how the image needs to look. But what is the correct technical exposure when we're in the field capturing the image data ready to be processed? And this in fact is a little bit of a cheat here because I've used two captures that have been blended together to make an HDR image. So let's just quickly first look at what was captured from the camera in the initial phase. And I knew at the time I was making this exposure that the brightness range was going to exceed that capability of the sensor because I had the sunrise coming up here over the horizon and I had a lot of rock in the foreground that was completely dark, and I suspected that this was going to be a problem, and so I decided I would make two exposures. The first exposure I made was based on getting the correct amount of light in the sky, and I disregarded the foreground. The second exposure I made, if you have a look here, the first one was -2 stops to allow the light in the sky to be correctly rendered. The second exposure, which is what the camera metered in the first instance, no exposure compensation, gave me good exposure on the foreground, but the sky was blown out. And you can see here that we have a problem. The histogram here in Lightroom, and bearing in mind that this is from the raw data, not the image on the back of the camera, I took a test exposure and could see that the camera was not going to be able to give me the correct exposure for both the foreground and the background in the one capture, so I knew instantly that I was going to need to do a couple of exposures. Now some people go a bit crazy and might do 5 or 6 different exposures, but if you understand the capabilities of the sensor in your camera, and this camera has a base ISO setting of 64 and is capable of rendering in excess of 14 stops of exposure latitude, I knew that I didn't need 5 different exposures, I only really needed 2. So I had my first exposure rendered for the foreground, let the sky blow out, took a second exposure at -2 stops to render the sky adequately, and then using the combination of images in Lightroom to create an HDR rendering. This is what I was able to come up with, and after doing some finessing with the color balance, lighting and so forth, the final image was rendered this way. So when we're looking at what is the correct technical exposure, what we want to get in our image is an exposure that renders our brightest brights to the right of the histogram without blowing out, and then we can then work with that. If we've lost detail with a blown out exposure such as this one, you'll see here that a large part of the image is blown out, and if I go into the develop module and hover over the highlight clipping warning, you'll see that a large amount of the sky is in fact overexposed. There is no detail recorded there. If I then look at the second image, which was the exposure for the sky, there is still a tiny little bit of overexposure there, a little bit of clipping in the highlights, but with a good raw capture and a little bit of adjustment you can recover adequately the highlight detail, which is what I did before I rendered it into an HDR. And in the process of rendering the HDR, the white balance was not quite what I wanted, but of course we can amend that when we go through the processing steps later on. So getting the correct technical exposure is all about getting the histogram as far to the right as possible, what's called exposed to the right, or ETTR. Keep it as far to the right as possible without clipping the highlights, and maintain enough detail. But in some situations you are going to need to make an adjustment, or in some extreme situations like this you are going to need to maybe capture 2 or more images and blend them together, where you can balance out that exposure range. So to summarize what we've learnt in this little exercise looking at exposure, we've learnt several things. We've learnt that the aperture controls the amount of the image that appears to be sharply focused. We've learnt that the shutter speed can control the amount of movement either in the camera or in what you're photographing. And of course the ISO, being the other component, controls how the quality of your image may be affected by using high ISO to compensate for poor lighting conditions. And that sometimes the camera's light meter doesn't always get the exposure level right, and we have to intervene. And in extreme situations like this one, we may need to use multiple exposures blended together in HDR to obtain a good enough exposure for processing. I hope that's all been interesting, and I look forward to seeing you again soon.